And I'm just going to click about 14 buttons to make this thing work. All right, here we go.
But crutches weren't good enough. He knew they were political poison. They would, he
and laugh as they went along. It was a slow process, but they looked as though they were taking their time so they could smile. People see
But
that
there's
this
him
is
learning how to
difficult
walk with his
or
braces.
takes effort or it hurts. They would chat and
Talking
joke
about it's
and
silly to
laugh
hold
as
a
they
brace
went along.
money
It
in
was a
his
slow
mouth.
process, but they looked as though they were taking their time so they could smile at people and say hello to the crowd as they went along. And it was showbiz, but it worked.
Paralyzed from the hips down.
Only 4 seconds of film exist which clearly show the walk Franklin so tirelessly practiced.
Guy with a cigarette pop in.
The goal really was simply to take enough steps to get from a car into a building or from his seat on the stage to the podium and back again.
So someone's holding him, so like.
If he could do that without seeming hopelessly crippled, he'd succeeded.
And so there he is standing. They would lock the brace, and he would stand. His hip would get really sore, he'd be exhausted, but he worked his upper body incredibly hard. Here is a picture of him going to an opening of the old Washington Senators, not the Major League Baseball team in Washington, D.C. at that time. And rarely would they show pictures of him in his wheelchair. The reporters did not show them, or show him being carried into his car. But he had rigged up a car where he could do everything by hand. The brake was by hand and the accelerator was by hand. And they have that now for people who don't have use of their limbs. And he was able to carry out this illusion. And it was remarkable. And he gave the impression he beat polio. And if he could beat polio, what's the depression? He could beat that. And so the election of 32, Hoover, the Republicans are stuck with him. He was the Republican nominee, yet he is blamed for the depression, the bonus army, all those things. Here's FDR coming in. Now, FDR was he spoke at the convention, and then in 1930 was elected governor of New York. And so he's the governor of that time, the most populous and wealthiest state, and looked like he had a golden opportunity to win the nomination. Now, he promised more direct action, but he did something unheard of. He would dub his program the New Deal. And he gave that, actually wasn't the plan, but he went to the Democratic Convention, the nominating convention in Chicago. No candidate had done that. So Democrats from all over go pick the nominee. Southern conservatives and Northern conservatives tried to keep him out. It didn't work. But Roosevelt flew from Albany, the capital of New York, to Chicago. And that's why it shows the plane. Now, a plane might not seem like a big deal now, but in 1932, that was a huge deal. It implied something new, exciting, different. He didn't take the train, showing that this is a new crisis that requires new kind of action. And at this nominating convention, he gave his acceptance speech. Never been done before. Now they all do it. Now the convention is more window dressing, but still. And he promised aggressive government action. The government is going to act. The government is going to do something about the depression. And in the speech, he said this line: I pledge myself to a new deal for the American public. It wasn't the plan, but the New Deal fit in perfectly with his program for two reasons. First off, it's new, it's different, it's a slogan, but there's something else. Remember Teddy Roosevelt? His program was the square deal. So hit like I'm going to finish what my cousin started. And it's very clever. And so then there'll be a fair deal. That will be Harry Truman's. And every candidate will try to do something like this. Have something that people can identify with. And so Dwight Eisenhower will be a Republican, but he'll call his program dynamic conservatism, which, by the way, is kind of meaningless. It doesn't matter. It's a slogan. John Kennedy was the New Frontier. Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society. Richard Nixon, New Federalism. Ronald Reagan was Let's Make America Great Again. And, of course, Donald Trump would copy that word for word. And pretty soon, that became bigger than whatever they're running for. President Obama was hope and change. What does that even mean? Doesn't matter. It's something to grab hold of. Make America great again for Trump. What does that even mean? Doesn't mean anything, really. But it's something to grab hold of. Now, he promised direct action. So, when the election happened, at a time where farm foreclosures were at their highest and it looked like revolution on the plains, Roosevelt and the Democrats rode to one of the most resounding victories in history. This is an incumbent who got crushed. Incumbents have all the advantages, and yet Roosevelt and the Democrats swept in. Now, was it a pro-Roosevelt election? He was very popular, but it was more of an anti-Hoover election, without a doubt. A sweeping victory for the Democrats. And then the whole thing about fell apart. The worst 5 months in American history took place. And please get that down. The winter of 32 was the worst winter in American history. The worst. Oh, I did print it out. I thought I didn't write that down. The winter of 32, 33. The whole country began to look like revolution was on the edge. It was, and don't forget, the election was November, but back then, this is the last election, that the inauguration will not take place until March. In fact, this is a big reason why they switched that. A similar thing happened in 1860. Lincoln was elected in November, and in the 5 months before he took office, the Confederacy started and the Deep South all seceded. He's president-elect. The president was still Buchanan in 1860-61, and here it's Hoover. And Hoover actively tried to make things worse. Hoover was bitter. He thought Roosevelt was going to destroy the country, and he tried to make it worse so then he could say, look, I would have been better. They should have picked me, vote for me in 36. I have a hard time being positive about Hoover because he did this. And a couple things happened. The River Rouge factory, the biggest factory in the world, was a Ford factory. Henry Ford had shut down the River Rouge. By the way, these are destitute people kicked off their farm, and that's one of the biggest Hoovervilles outside of New York City. There was a massive protest of former Ford workers at the River Rouge who wanted their jobs. But Henry Ford said, I'm not going to hire you. There's no one buying cars. I should add, he did give his son Edsel $1 million in gold that same year. He was not suffering. Yes, he named his son Edsel. And if you know anything about cars, the most disastrous car ever made would be called the Edsel by Ford in the late 1950s and nearly destroyed the company. Edsel. I know, it's a great name. So this looked like Civil War in Detroit. Farmers began to revolt. In fact, they took over, for example, Sioux City, Iowa was taken over by farmers. And they went through the banks and began to burn up mortgages. And then the biggest wave of bank failures took place. It looked like the entire financial system of the world was going to break down. I should add, it's no coincidence. At the very same time, this was happening in this little country called Germany. And that is how Hitler would be able to take power, even though his party, the National Socialists, were actually losing seats. I should add, Hitler did the same thing about the planes. He rode planes all over Germany, with the big thing, Hitler over Germany, implying Hitler is something new and exciting. And Hoover consciously made it worse. He purposely kept his Treasury Department from helping banks from getting better. He tried his best to coerce FDR into supporting Hoover's programs, even though Hoover is sitting in Albany watching this whole thing fall apart. Hoover was, well, it showed what a petty person he was. It was more important for him to make his reputation seem better than actually watching people suffer. And so he tried to hamstring FDR. And so let's go and get to this. So when Hoover was inaugurated, when FDR was inaugurated, people were watching, and this looked like this could be the last inauguration. People understate how bad things were. It looked like the country was on the edge of falling apart. This is the most dangerous time for the United States since the Civil War. And because the country survived, and FDR would turn out to be so popular and so important as a president, people forget how bad it was. So it's a little clip of a video, and we're going to start it. It's going to talk about Mayor LaGuardia of New York, who was a Republican, but he would become a New Dealer as they became called. Hopefully this works. Yes.
But in March of 1933, the homeless and the poor lost an advocate in Congress. Defeated in the Democratic landslide, LaGuardia returned to a New York where victims of the Depression camped in cardboard shanties. LaGuardia swore he would give up politics, but few believed he would stay on the sidelines if Roosevelt's New Deal could help the city of New York.
History turns a page. President and Mrs. Hoover, leaving the White House after 4 trying years, greet Mrs. Roosevelt on the portico. The president-elect awaits them in the car in which he and Mr. Hoover will ride to the Capitol together. The retiring president and the new, the man who bore the burdens and the man who now assumes them.
Now, Roosevelt was shockingly charming. He's one of those guys who could just talk to anybody and make them just love him. He had this incredible gift, which is really a good gift for a politician. You know, politicians come in and knew everyone's name and talk to him. And Roosevelt was one of those guys, when he was president, people would come in, never met Roosevelt before, come into the executive office. Not quite the Oval Office yet, that's coming a little bit later. But they'd come in, and Roosevelt would talk to them, and Roosevelt would just, kind of caress their ego and talk to them. And they would walk out thinking 2 things. Number 1, I have a new best friend, and his name is Franklin Roosevelt. And number 2, Roosevelt agrees with me 100% on everything. The next person would come in, and they have a totally different point of view than that first person who came in. And they'd go out thinking 2 things after they met Roosevelt. Number 1, I have a new best friend in the world. And number 2, they agree with me 100%. Roosevelt had that gift. So when Hoover sat down and talked to him, Roosevelt just assumed, okay, we're going to be, or Roosevelt would start his, talking to him and charm him like he charmed everybody. Heck, the guy charmed Joseph Stalin. The guy could charm anybody. But Hoover was so mad and convinced that Roosevelt was going to destroy the world that Roosevelt started talking to him. Started talking to Hoover. All Hoover did is turn and look at him and made this sound. Bah! And looked straight at him. Just made a grunt. So Roosevelt's like, whatever, and just went to the crowd. When he gave this speech, people listened.
An historical moment in the life of a nation is approaching.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
The energy that was let loose right after that inauguration was enormous. Washington had never known anything like it. Stylistically, there was just this abundance of movement and activity and a sense of let's get on with the problem.
And you felt that this guy came and he was going to save the people. And a tremendous feeling for him. Oh, the elderly people, they could kiss his toenails. That's how much they loved this guy.
I think he was primarily a person who was convinced that there was poverty in the country, need in the country, and he wanted to do something to help.
Okay, so that's Roosevelt. Let me tell you about that speech, though. You have to think about it. Everyone's listening to this speech. Everyone's really watching. They're paying attention. And Roosevelt, who had a wonderful speaking voice, he came out of the radio and was just brilliant. But let me begin with a couple things about that speech. So he said in the very first paragraph, this great nation will endure it's really hard to give this speech I want to really enunciate, but I have a mask on. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So you've probably all heard that, nothing to fear but fear itself. You think, well, what does that even mean? Well, he's talking about the fear that people had in the banks, of the financial system, that everything's breaking down. And he's saying, we will do something about this. And let me read one more thing he says. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than monetary profit. He laid out this idea that a lot of people have, that this was caused by greed. People trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And he said, it's not your fault, average Americans, it is the wealthy. And that's part of the reason why the richest people in the United States would consider Roosevelt a traitor to this class. And so there's a funny cover of New Yorker. I enjoy that one immensely. And so we're coming to what's called the first New Deal. And the first New Deal, there's going to be 2 New Deals and then an attempted third. And it's going to be that he's going to do as many bills as humanly possible over the first 100 days. 100 days. 13 major bills. And since all will have various initials, this is going to be called the alphabet soup of all these different bills, like the NRA, the CWA, the CCC, the AAA. You'll have to know a few of them. But the big thing is try everything. Experiment. Direct government action. If it doesn't work, we throw it away and try something new. Now, politically, this is actually really hard to do now. If it doesn't work, then they'll be tied to it for a very long time. But he will try anything. And so, and his main goal, save capitalism. Has everyone got that? He wants to save capitalism. The only way to save capitalism is to reform it. Now, his enemies are going to call him a Bolshevik or a communist. But he's saying the only chances to save capitalism is direct government action. So he's going to get enemies on both sides. But he will dub this liberal. And this is where we get the term liberal for direct government action or government or liberal economics. And it's basically many of the progressive and populist platforms. Everyone got that? It's many of those. But if you go to Europe, for example, and you're liberal, we would call, if you're in Germany, let's say, and they say we're liberal, that would be conservative to us. They have a different point of view. They use the words differently. It's just a label. And so you hear people today call themselves progressives. Well, they're Roosevelt liberals. And so let's get into a few of the bills.
Something to help. New York had declared a bank holiday for the banks in New York. But Roosevelt followed it up with a bank holiday for the national government and throughout the country.
By early 1933, Americans were lining up to withdraw their money from a banking system on the brink of collapse. Roosevelt closed the banks for 4 days and pushed through an emergency banking bill authorizing $2 billion in new money to help pay off depositors.
So Roosevelt pushed this bill through Congress immediately. An emergency banking bill that promised $2 billion to banks. Basically, just going to give money to banks. With the idea being that the banks will have money. Then we'll send inspectors out to make sure the banks are safe. Now, they don't have this set up. This is all, can they convince people that the banking industry is safe, or are more people going to come out and withdraw money? And then he did something very clever. Using the new media radio, he did.
The new president went on radio with the first of his fireside chats.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington,
he made listeners feel as though he were talking to them and to them individually and alone.
He sold the people by
And
rate.
this was a remarkable technique that he had.
Roosevelt would caress with his voice the microphone. And he treated the people as though they had intelligence.
Wow.
let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work.
If this doesn't work,
it is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
What a voice he has.
I remember in those days, if you went through any area during the fireside chats, you could hear them walking down the street. You didn't have to worry about getting home in order to hear it, because it would be turned on all the way home.
We would ourselves sit down and talk over what he had said, and then we would look at what was happening all around about us, but still come out feeling good about it, feeling better than we had felt, though we had problems.
We were a serious country. The people had something to do with the government, and they felt in Roosevelt they had somebody who understood them, somebody who spoke to them. Other politicians found him mendacious and tricky, which indeed he was, but he was also had a direct pipeline to the people.
When the banks reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals. Roosevelt had restored confidence, not only in the banks, but in the possibility of recovery. In the first 100 days of the New Deal, Roosevelt and Congress created 10 new agencies to combat the effects of the Depression. The alphabet soup of New Deal programs had immediate impact on the lives of millions of Americans. The first jobs program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, put 250,000 young men to work restoring the nation's forests.
Now, restoring is an interesting word. What it meant is going through the forests and parks and building trails, building camps. If you go to, did you guys do the Goosecar Caverns thing? And you know that whole trail, that was built by the CCC. You know, they later on redid it, but that's the CCC. So many trails and parks, buildings, anything you find in national forests were done by the CCC. So it hired young people who were chronically unemployed. It was small, but had great, just emotional effect.
Roosevelt preferred a system of work relief to giving out welfare checks.
Direct aid.
But the president decided he had to push for direct federal relief, or millions would starve.
This was a...
So what he's talking about is fair. Fair is going to be direct aid, direct cash payments to people who did not have money. And they didn't want to do that partially because they didn't know how they would set it up. But this is what happened during the pandemic. 3 different times, direct aid. Because something interesting happens. If you get people who don't have money, what's the first thing they do? Yeah, because they have a huge amount of pent-up demand. They need stuff now. And that immediately gets out in the economy, increases demand. It's actually probably the most efficient. It will probably increase the economy about 5 times the amount the original.
Absolutely new program for the federal government to be engaged in, that is to be handing out relief. It wasn't much handed out on any level, and suddenly for it to be a major program with millions of dollars involved, with people getting money for nothing, as it was said by the opposition to it.
President Roosevelt has given me the job of administering the $500 million appropriated by Congress under the Emergency Relief Act of 1933 to help care for the 18 million persons whom the Depression has plunged from self-support to public dependency.
In his first 2 hours on the job, Harry Hopkins dispensed $5 million in relief funds.
I came to work for the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, in September of 1933. We were a group of young people. For most of us, this was our first job. And we were terribly wrapped up in what we were doing, very excited about it, felt that the future of the world depended upon us.
So there was never any difference between work in the office and being away from the office. When we went to eat or to restaurants or go even taking our wives dancing that hot fall up on the roof of the Powhatan Hotel, very few people danced. They talked the whole time. We were talking about our jobs.
Eleanor Roosevelt would get literally thousands of letters a day. And poor Harry Hopkins would get the brunt of them, with my grandmother writing on the top in hand, "Harry, can't we do something about this person?"
With the government programs underway, Roosevelt turned his attention to the private sector.
Here's the
Blue Eagle's loyal legions on parade. Soldier and sailor, millionaire and office boy, society matron and shop girl, elbow to elbow in the NRA Army. 250,000 economic warriors forming the greatest peacetime demonstration in American history.
In September 1933, the government sponsored a spectacular parade up New York's Fifth Avenue to promote an unprecedented federal effort, the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt called the NRA a partnership in planning between government and industry.
So what it's going to be government planning of industry. So government will step in and plan industry. Everybody, you'll voluntarily enter it, but then get the advantages of the government planning. And here's what it is.
Its goal, to speed recovery by establishing profit levels for business and wage levels for labor. In a show of national...
So it's going to set, everyone got that, production, profits, and wages. It's going to set them all, with the idea being they can coordinate. Roosevelt was sold that this work, the WP, or the War Productions Administration, or War Productions Board in World War I had worked. So we'll do like World War I. If this is a war, we'll organize it like we're fighting a war. I have to add this. It failed miserably. And I think you can probably guess why. Think how big it's going to be. Unwieldy, difficult to organize. It will not work the way they want. And Roosevelt by 34 would kind of abandon this. But there's one more thing you have to get that it would do. Where's my mouse?
National solidarity. More than 2 million employers across the country promised to abide by the NRA codes.
The NRA means to me a steady job with more pay. The extra kind comes in handy. I got a new job and it's great to be working again.
Thanks to President Roosevelt's plan, the NRA, which has made it possible for me to resume my position as a manager.
I am 100% in back of President Roosevelt's Recovery Act, and I want every one of my customers to know it.
The NRA also supported the right of employees to form unions and bargain collectively.
That one you have to get down to. The NRA also says, we'll allow for unions to organize. Unions raise wages. And so Roosevelt wanted unions to raise wages that will increase demand. Companies hate this because workers have more control and wages go up.
Garment workers in New York City used the NRA to win higher wages and better working conditions.
It was almost enough for a president of this great nation to take account of us foreigners, which is what all of the union members were, practically without any exception, and acknowledge that things are bad and that workers are permitted to organize.
We must say that the NRA improved our needle industry. We are able now to make a living better than any time before. We will
Ooh. All right, so those are the big programs they started. Well, let me get through a few more of them very quickly. The first New Deal. The crisis on the farms was becoming an absolute chaos. There's revolution in the streets, and farm foreclosures. People are kicked off their farms, and this is going to lead to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, the AAA, or the A. Everyone got that? The AAA. And what it did is this. Wow, it all popped up at once. But it was going to stabilize farm prices. How's it going to do this? It will pay farmers not to grow. So if there's oversupply, it'll pay farmers not to grow products. So the farmers will not grow. This will bring down production, and they'll tax producers. Got the idea? So there is some waste. Some big farmers got money. It hurt sharecroppers, but it worked for the most part. Except sharecroppers got crushed. But it's going to be found unconstitutional. Okay. So I will post something tomorrow. If you check the post, that extra credit is there. I will take it for today. So you can check it. Right now, 70 on Saturday.